Hi, and welcome into the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm your host, Greg Payne, and this week I am excited to be talking with Ethan Yazel. Now, Ethan runs the YouTube channel and website called I Love Muzzleloading, and I came across this in some of my YouTube searches for information about muzzleloading and just absolutely loved watching these videos that Ethan's doing. So what's great about this is through watching Ethan's channel, I was able to figure out that he had a really good connection with his grandfathers and his great-grandfather. And Ethan joins me and really talks about how muzzle loading is one of these unique connection points that can span through family history, community history, regional history, and, the history of the United States, as well as other countries that have used muzzle loaders in terms of, gaining food, sportsmanship, things of that nature. So this is going to be a fun conversation with Ethan. We get into the history of how he and his family became involved, what it's meant to him. So I know you're going to enjoy this conversation with Ethan. And be sure after you watch this conversation to go over to his channel, I Love Muzzleloading, and check out some of the videos that he's done. It's got a lot of information about muzzleloaders, about the muzzleloading community, about the art that goes into creating muzzleloaders that are really unique. And without further ado, let's jump into this conversation with Ethan. Hi, Ethan. Welcome to the Cool Grandpa podcast. I'm excited to have you on and learn more about your grandfathers.
Thanks, Greg. I'm really excited about the opportunity.
Now, as we get into this, I'd love for you to introduce yourself a little bit, help us get to understand and know you while we then start to learn about your grandfathers.
Okay. My name's Ethan. I run a website called I Love Muzzleloading. I'm in a unique position really in the 21st century because I have a deep family connection with the world of muzzleloading, which in itself connects us to a lot of American history, which is a lot of what I focus on with the website and kind of taking muzzleloading history and American history and connecting it to a kind of American culture in a contemporary sense, and then muzzleloading's history in the last 100 or so years, as it's seen quite a bit of change and connects us still to this day. I like to talk about that many of us are here because of a muzzleloader and somebody with a muzzleloader, and it's a lot of fun to kind of connect those dots through history and then up into today with something that a lot of people just consider to be something old or something that hangs on the wall or something they've heard stories about.
Oh, sure. Well, and how I learned about you was through your YouTube channel and watching some of the videos. I know that you had mentioned you had some different, I think, boxes and some different things that you use for muzzle loading that passed down from your grandfather. So that's what really piqued my interest, was to learn more about those relationships.
Yeah, it's something that's a really fond part of my memory, and it's the kind of thing that I hope becomes a part of my kids' memories as well, as they can spend some time with their grandparents, with muzzleloading.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I want to get into that a little bit, but first, I'd love for you to introduce your grandfathers, help us get to know them, and just understand that relationship a little bit more.
Yeah, so my grandfathers were named Joseph Barnes and Harold Yazel. Both of them were born just before the American or the Great Depression here in the United States, and lived through it as young boys. And then in their kind of adolescent years and young adult years would go on to operate in different functions during the Second World War. Joe was on the West Coast as a radio man for the Coast Guard, while Harold was in the Army island hopping in the Pacific. Neither of my grandfathers really talked about that, but I think for a lot of people who knew people that lived through the Second World War, that was kind of an iconic part. And kind of a defining thing for their character. And much like many other people who lived through the war and came home and started lives, they didn't talk about it a whole lot. but it was still kind of I think a landmark really in their timeline. But uh, both of my grandfathers, Joseph and Harold, would return home to Indiana and start families. Um, Joseph worked for the local electric company here in about central Indiana, really at the time, and spent his whole career there. From a time period when people did that, and that was common. Harold would return home and become a tool and die maker for a local spring factory and developed springs for a lot of different popular toasters for the time period, or fishing reels too. We have quite a few fishing reels kind of in our family archive that my grandfather helped design and manufacture the springs for, which is kind of cool. There's a lot of Zebco reels out there that he designed springs for. Um, that kind of through that, then, both started families, had multiple kids. Harold had 3 kids, one being my father, and Joseph and his wife and my grandmother had 4 daughters. And, kind of through the timeline, somehow they met and we connected, or they connected, and then I'm here today.
Oh, that's great. And it sounds like your grandfathers were a little bit similar to mine in that, well, I mean, mine was a wheat farmer out in Oregon, but had spent his World War II time, and then would talk about it a little bit, but mostly would talk about other people's activities or what his brothers might have done or something along those lines. And my grandfather spent time helping to train pilots, so he was stateside
Okay.
throughout the whole conflict. But I think most of those guys kind of grew up with this thing like, well, I didn't do much. I just kind of played my part. I showed up. There's really not much to talk about. And then, of course, you do have those that might have experienced some combat and some other challenges that really didn't want to relive those. And
Yeah.
certainly we can understand some of that. What I'd love for you to do is take us back and share with us some of the earliest memories that you had of your grandfathers, and what are some of the activities that you would do with them?
Harold, my father's father, was a real outdoorsman. So he'd come from a family of local, really just hog farmers in a couple towns north of here. But he had grown up spending his whole life outside, or a lot of it, like a lot of young boys did for that time period. And by the time I came along, my father and grandfather had converted an old family field, or cow pasture, really, into a tree planting that was a young woods and about a 10-acre wetland. So by that time, Harold had retired, and I speak about Harold a lot here because I live in the same town that he lived in. So there's a lot of, even as a boy, there's a lot of close connection there. I would go to their house, my grandparents' house, after elementary school and hang out, around the house or outside. But some of my earliest memories with him are walking around the pond and doing a lot of fishing, because that's something that I think a lot of grandparents like to do. And Harold had built himself a nice little fishing area in his backyard, really, where he could go out and fish for bass and bluegill, and spent a lot of time there when he wasn't still tinkering in a machine shop. Once you're a tool and die guy, I don't know that you ever transition out of wanting to play with that kind of stuff.
Right, right. Yeah, almost like a mechanical engineer or whatever. It's like there's always something you can tweak.
Yeah, there's a lot of tinkering in that side of the family. Joseph and his wife, my grandmother, lived a couple hours away in a little bit of a larger town. So, and he was retired as well. There's a lot of age gap for my family in those generations. So both of my sets of grandparents had children later in life, and my folks waited a little bit longer as well. So by the time I came along and really have any memories, all of my grandparents had really retired and just kind of puttered along like a lot of people do. So uh, with Joseph, a lot of my earliest memories are actually with muzzleloading and spending time with him. I learned to shoot with Joseph on my mother's side of the family, and that's really part of the core of that. I think I would wish. I know we're going to get into it later, but one of my earliest memories with them with Joseph was getting up onto the bench line, which is just shooting a muzzleloader off of a rest onto a bench. But I couldn't reach around the entire bench and around the stock of the gun, so I was sat on a case of soda cans so I could get up and reach around. and getting up on that case of soda is one of those early memories. Like, I don't know why it stuck with me. Maybe it was the first shots after, but that's something that's like cemented in my brain. So a lot of memories of both sides of my grandparents are at several national muzzleloading matches where both sides of the family would kind of come together and we'd participate in different things that each family liked to participate in. And I think, like a lot of people with grandparents that age, there are a lot of trips out to eat, especially in the big city, and a lot of ice cream runs maybe on a hot summer day for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I talked with the former CEO of Bluebell, and we had mentioned that exact same thing, is that ice cream is just one of those things that around grandparents and families, it always seems to be part of that equation for sure. Now, how did the relationship start to change a little bit as you were getting older, as you didn't have to sit on the soda cans so much anymore?
It was interesting, I think, for a lot of kids my age and my friends at the time, they would go to an amusement park or a beach or, something like that. But for us, we did a little bit of that here in the Midwest. But, a lot of that family time was spent around muzzle loading. And as I got older, I remember, kind of transitioning from being a kid to there being some expectation of accuracy, I guess, at the base level. At some point, I imagine you want your grandkid to start doing well. And so, especially at the muzzleloading matches, when we were on the line and there was a target posted, it was more of a coach and an athlete kind of relationship, where off the line, it was ice cream time or hanging around the campfire, running around playing. But on the line, there started to be that a little bit of focus as, okay, you're the third generation here. It's time to sit down and really focus on this. Don't be thinking about ice cream or playing in the creek or going fishing. It's time to zero in, and I think looking back on, at the time, I can remember being a little frustrated with that, as being a kid. But, I think that's just part of the ebb and flow of life. And looking back on it, you do just about anything to be back in that chair or back on the line, with them coaching on what to do, because you only get so much time with them.
Oh, sure. And when you were starting out and they were helping you out, were you starting out shooting their rifles, and was it primarily rifles, or were you doing pistols as well?
So my mother's side of the family focused on some kind of rested rifle at short and long range. And my father's side of the family focused on muzzleloading pistols or just pistol shooting in general. So I had the unique opportunity to have access to kind of two disciplines of equipment there, where a lot of families might have one, or part of one. I had access to quite a bit of tools and equipment to try out different disciplines there. So with my mother's side of the family, that was a lot of bench rest shooting, and that was using their muzzleloader. That was using their rifles. So that was the same rifle that my mother used and that her sisters had used, using the same equipment. And it was nice being a kid at the time. I would just sit and focus on the target, where my grandfather would continue to load for me. The neat thing about those muzzleloading bench guns is they have a weight limit. So it's a really heavy barrel. That one was a 54 caliber. So it's a rather large ball.
Wow.
But I think the weight limit is around 13 to 15 pounds, depending on the match that you're shooting in. So there's quite a bit of weight there to work with. And, another memory, I think, along with all of this was when Grandpa was, he was done picking it up and loading. He had kind of had enough of that. His body was kind of worn, and then my mother picked up, but Grandpa was still there, coaching me and guiding me on the wind there. My father's side of the family, my grandfather actually developed a line of muzzleloading match pistols that are still used today and still kind of sought after. So a lot of that tinkering that I'd mentioned before at the spring manufacturing factory there, in the evenings, he would it was just a different time for business and for American culture. He was allowed to go back in and work on his projects there at his bench and use the company equipment as long as he supplied the materials. So he built this little line of muzzleloading match pistols. So there's out there floating around are Yazel muzzleloading match pistols, and those were all built by my grandfather, and later a little bit my father, a couple different varieties of them. So, uh, my mother and her sisters, I believe, still hold several national records, and I know that my father still holds several on the pistol side of things. So there's a little bit of weight with that. I'm never going to be as good of a shooter as they were. Life just takes you in different directions, but I still enjoy it, and I still look back fondly on the balancing act of learning the two different disciplines.
How did your grandparents get involved in this? Because we talked about that muzzleloading's kind of a niche and people fall into it in different ways. But how did your grandparents get involved in this?
So my father's father, Harold, to the best of my knowledge, was interested in muzzleloading, being a young outdoorsman before the war, but it was a lot of coming home after the war. His brother hunted a lot, as did Harold, and so they really got into muzzleloading both as a means to hunt, because that was an age where conservation had kind of really started. My grandfather actually won one of the lottery draws to do the first deer hunt in Indiana. At the time, as conservation kind of spun up to what we see today, they did a lottery on some public land in southern Indiana, and part of it was you had to hunt with a muzzleloader. And so my grandfather and his brother loved muzzleloading by the time that came around, and so they put in to try to draw that tag to go hunt a deer, because there wasn't a lot of deer hunting in Indiana at that time. And that was kind of a neat story for me, that he had that interest and tried to do as much of it as he could. So he comes home after the war, starts working, and you have hobby time and free time and things. You've got a young family, and starts trucking the entire family around the country, really, to all these different muzzleloading matches and events just to get as much of it as he could. I think the drive for accuracy and the skill of it kind of scratched the same mechanical itch as manufacturing did and the tool and die making did for him. My mother's father goes back a little bit further. Southern or southeastern Indiana was kind of a hotbed for muzzleloading, and still is today, and that bleeds into Ohio and Kentucky as well. But in the 30s, radio, of course, was huge. You didn't have podcasts then. And my great-grandfather had heard an advertisement on the radio about a muzzleloading match in southern Indiana or just across the border into Ohio that was sponsored by the radio company. The match was sponsored by the radio company. They advertised it on the radio. And one day he decides they're going to go and attend this match. So my grandfather, his brother, and a couple friends load up, and I think it was a Model A Ford. I think it could be a T, but I think it was a Model A Ford. 5 of them load up into that car and drive 2 or 3 hours south to attend this match. And there's a funny story that goes along with that is they get there and they're watching the match and they're enjoying it so much that they don't realize that it's past lunchtime, and they're all, young men and boys, they're getting hungry, and they go up to the concessionaire and they ask for lunch, and the concessionaire says, all I've got left is one bowl of soup. And my great-grandfather tells them, well, I'll take that bowl of soup and 5 spoons then. And they all shared that one bowl of soup as their lunch before watching the finishing part of the match and then driving north home. No AC, not really an enclosed car or anything. It's just a different time. But the hot summer heat bearing down on you. You don't think of Indiana as a hot summer, but it can be. And on the way home, my grandfather always said that his father turned to him and said, that was a lot of fun. Next year, I'm going to go back with a gun of my own. And the details, I was fortunate enough to talk with my grandfather a lot about that aspect of things. I was able to record him a little bit talking about, especially the bowl of soup story, because it was a story he loved to tell. It was a really fond memory for him, splitting that bowl of soup. But I don't know how. It's something I need to talk to my mother and her sisters about. But somehow, somewhere, that next year, they went back, and they went back in 1938. So the first shoot was 1937. They went and watched. The National Muzzleloading Rifle Association was founded in 33. So just 4 years after it was founded in Portsmouth, Ohio, was the first time that they had attended, and then they went back then in 38 and participated in that match. My grandfather never really talked about how well his father did, but at the time, he and a group of friends that had come together down at the match wanted to shoot and wanted to compete, but there weren't any kids matches for the time. And my grandfather bugged the right number of adults to find the people in charge. And the guy in charge, his name was Boss Johnson at the time. He told my grandfather, if you find 5 other boys who are willing to participate in a match, we'll make a kids match for you. And so him and his brother did. They found a group of people, and they had the first, what we call a junior match at the National Association. And my grandfather, Joseph Barnes, won that first junior match. And we've got a program from that year, 1938. His name is in there as the winner of that junior match, which is a lot of fun. And so his life changed a lot. By that time period, you're kind of at the tail end of the Great Depression, but with World War II starting, they moved west and welded on ships until he was of age, and then went into the Coast Guard and came back and found himself back into Indiana, and it's that same kind of hotbed, really, that we have here for muzzleloading competition, and worked his way back into that. I've got a picture of him shooting a rifle in 1938. I don't know if that was his rifle, the family rifle, or if that was another rifle. For the time, the photographs for the period aren't the greatest, but he found his way back to it and raised a family doing it. My grandbrother always said that if he wanted to go golfing, he'd have to take all the girls with him. So he chose to take them to a muzzleloading match instead, and raised a family of shooters.
Oh, wow.
Sorry, that was really long-winded.
Yeah, no, that was that's a great story. I love that background. And a question that jumped to mind with that was, at that time in those 30s, 40s, and post-war, were those folks getting into muzzleloading not only for the shooting, but then also, was it also the historical reenactment that you see today, or the interpretation that you see today, or was it show up in your overalls and your farming clothes and you just shoot the guns?
It was a little bit of a mix. I mean, it sounds weird to say, but they were much closer to the history at the time. At that time, people's parents and grandparents could have been involved in the Civil War in some aspect. And I don't know that they looked at history the same way that we do today with the historic reenactment and living history. That time period, though, the Great Depression really saw a surge in interest in muzzleloading for a couple reasons. In the Appalachian Mountains, muzzleloading never really went away through that time period. And the Depression, it sounds weird to say, but in a way helped keep it around, because families had these rifles and they had the equipment to shoot them, and it was relatively cheap. So you still had families being fed by muzzleloaders through the Great Depression and through various economic issues into the 30s and the early 40s, before manufacturing really changed for the country. At that time period, too, you also had a dramatic arms race of development for centerfire cartridges, and things started to get really complex. They really started to push the limits of manufacturing and engineering with what we call wildcat cartridges for the time, where we're building more pressure than ever before. We're using smaller, more aerodynamic bullets, trying to shoot farther or shoot with more power, like cartridges like your like 22 zipper and that kind of thing. Like 223 Wild, I think, is another one. But with that radical development, with the centerfire things, you had a group of people looking at that development and saying, that's a little too far. What if we went back and saw what we could get out of what everybody considers to be our grandfathers and great-grandfathers' guns? Pope did a ton of research and developed a lot of interesting mathematical and mechanical application for all of this. And even into the centerfire era, Pope still claimed that the most accurate way to seat a bullet for the most accurate shot was to do it through the muzzle. So it would be a muzzle-loaded bullet with a breech-loaded charge. But a guy by the name of Walter Klein is really credited to the resurgence of muzzleloading in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, because he did a ton of research out of Tennessee, and he was involved with the National Association at the time period. And actually the National Range in southern Indiana is named after Walter Klein. But he published a book called Muzzleloading Then and Now that cataloged a lot of the Southern Mountain, Appalachian Mountain muzzleloading history and how it connected to them in the contemporary sense in that time period. And so for us today, that becomes kind of muzzleloading then, but for them at that time, that was muzzleloading now. And so it created this fantastic landmark in time for us that we can go from now 2024, we can jump back to the early 1900s and say, okay, this is the thought process behind muzzleloading at this time. And with that, it's neat because while we don't have the historical reenactment necessarily for that time period, we do have connection to muzzleloading history. And there's a series of matches in this region called chunk or over the log matches that are direct continuation of matches that were continued through that time period and started really in the late 19th century and possibly even before, kind of down in the hills of that region in kind of the Appalachian Mountains. So a lot of the muzzleloading competition really comes from that hotbed in the Appalachian Mountains, where you have groups of people getting together to just shoot the mark, just test accuracy. You have guys, even during that time, the late 1800s, building custom rifles for these particular matches. And at the time, those original matches were with really as kind of a rung what you brung scenario, where if you had a muzzleloader, you brought a muzzleloader. If you had a centerfire cartridge gun, the new whiz-bang thing, you could bring that too. And there's a lot of neat photographs from the early 1900s, like 1903, 1905, I think, are some of the iconic pictures, where you have a group of, 20 or 30 guys lined up behind a series of logs that they used as their rest for those matches. It becomes really important as we get into the Great Depression, and it's something my grandfather talked about as they started to get more involved in these matches. And it's something that happened before that period too, because by the time my grandfather got into it, we're pretty much into the 40s, and things are really starting to change for the country. But there is a legacy there for those matches of something called a meat shoot or a turkey shoot for a lot of people. And today, conservation clubs still have those, where your prizes are meat or different items and things that people bring. But in the early 1900s, and especially through the Depression, those meat shoots became a really big deal. If you could shoot well, you could go win several pounds of meat or an entire ham and feed your family for a few days or a week off of that. And, if you think about it being in the Depression, we've all seen the photographs and things. We've talked about people who lived through that. The opportunity to have, a nice, my grandfather talked about canned salmon or canned pineapple bringing home from a shoot, how big of a deal that was for them and their family, how important that was. And it's that impact that I think is really cool. I mean, it's burning powder and shooting and being accurate. It's really cool. But those connections to things like that, those moments of like, we're in the Depression, we don't have much of anything. We can go and we can shoot and we can bring home some food. And that was important. And sorry, I kind of losing my train of thought there, but there's that importance of it. That's not necessarily because, the muzzleloaders are cool or they look cool or American history, but there's a part of that more recent history that is neat to connect with. So at that time period, muzzleloading was really about competition. And there was a lot of competition there. And that's what we still see today in this region. There's a lot of muzzleloading clubs, a lot of muzzleloading competition that stems from that early 1900s, where this is what we have. Some of us, this is what we can afford to shoot. And some of us, this is just what we're interested in. We're all getting together. There's a lot of great photographs out there of a bunch of early, 20s and 30s cars lined up at these different muzzleloading matches, and groups of people, like you said, in overalls, in farming clothes, but then you also see people in suit jackets with nice hats and ties. And it comes full circle now. There's several of my friends are starting to reenact the 20s and 30s as a living history exercise, like many of us do the 19th and 18th century, because we're starting to get that separation. So now there's kind of another wave of interest in that time period, but it's one of the first time periods where we have so much more concrete information because it's so recent to us.
Right. And one of the things that jumped out, I didn't even think about, is that when I've interviewed grandfathers, when I've interviewed people that came up through the Depression those years, or just lived in poor rural areas, sometimes you were given like 2 20-gauge shotgun rounds and you were expected to bring back 2 birds, or a couple of rounds of 22, and that whatever number of rounds you had, you were expected to bring back that number of game, because that's just how the families subsisted. And so I didn't even think about black powder still being used, or muzzleloaders still being used by some of these families through the Midwest and Appalachia, even in the 20s and 30s. So that's a great jog back, and both of these things were being used at the same time.
Yeah, it's easy to think about it as like a history book timeline, that you have all these things happening, by the late 19th century, really 20 years before the century changed, you have cartridges and repeating arms really becoming the thing. And that's kind of what everybody focuses on. There's still a lot of people, I drive a beat up old car, for a lot of people, it was what they had and it's what they continued to use. It's neat to think about things in that context, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And to your point, as basic as these things are, they withhold a lot of time and punishment if they're treated well. It's an iron barrel. There are some spring assemblies. There are some things in there, but if you have a good mechanic in the neighborhood or community, they can fix that. And then you have a wooden stock that, maybe you have to replace it, maybe not. But if you take care of these things, oil them down, do that, they're going to last for a long time.
Yeah, there's a lot of stories out there of families cleaning out a barn or cleaning out a closet that there's a muzzleloader sitting there and it's still loaded. It's not necessarily primed or dangerous necessarily, but you never know. You never know when it's the last time you're going to turn off your light at night. It's the same thing for those rifles. They didn't know that it was the last time they were getting set up in the house or the barn. They're just waiting for the next time to go out.
Oh, sure. And a question I've got for you too, these matches and these things that your grandfathers were involved in, were they shooting flintlocks or percussion?
There's a mixture of both. At that time period, the supplies were just readily available. Like a lot of local hardware stores would have firearms and things and ammunition on their store shelves. To my understanding, at least in this region of the Midwest, it was that way for muzzleloading supplies. There were several competing brands of powder, many more than we have now, where we just have, maybe 3, depending on the time of year and who's producing what. But a lot of this stuff was still readily available. And my father's father participated a lot in both percussion and flintlock. To my understanding, my mother's father focused primarily on the percussion side of things. My father's father got more interested in the what we consider to be traditional muzzleloading, which encompasses like flintlocks and things. Where my mother's father was much more interested in that early 20th century time period where it wasn't. There were side locks, absolutely, but a lot of the guns involved in the matches that he was involved in were actually underhammer, where there'd be a spring on the underside of the barrel that would be released by the trigger and slap up onto a nipple that would ignite the charge rather than a hammer on the side falling. And it was just one of those things that for that time period, those were kind of the race guns, the precision match guns, because the theory is, and it's been proven, and maybe it's not even a theory, but that underhammer is a lot faster. It's a lot of a shorter travel and a lighter travel for that hammer. And that kind of gets into the technical aspect of it. We don't, thinking about things in complex ways or like a race car is how I consider it. We've been racing cars for a long time, and just because what was fast then isn't fast now doesn't mean that it wasn't fast then. And so we have different thoughts and things when you get on the competition side, where it gets really weird and fun.
I do want to ask you how your relationship, maybe even apart from muzzle loading, continued to evolve and develop through your middle school and high school years, and what are some of the interactions that you had with your grandfathers during that time?
I would say still very close with all of my grandfathers, both of my grandfathers through that time period. I think, as you become an adolescent, you start getting interested in your own things. And I think I probably spent less time, at the pond in the woods or with my grandfather where he lived. But I was fortunate enough to go to college in the same town that my mother's father lived. And that really afforded me a lot of special time with him that I wouldn't, and I didn't otherwise get with my father's father, kind of being away from the town and time period. I think along with my aging and my changing, into a kid and a young adult, that it coincided a little bit with them aging as well. So I think, like many people, you kind of ebb and flow in those relationships, but I remember them always being supportive and excited, and we always, spent quality time together and had a good time. But, I think, at least for me, like middle school and high school is a little bit of a blur, as you're doing different things, you get involved with school, and, you think that stuff's important. And sadly, some of those relationships can fall by the wayside. But, coming in through college and things, I began to appreciate, I think, my family more at that time, kind of seeing what the rest of the world was like, and really try to touch back with that. I lived with my mother's father for a summer while I worked between semesters, and I still look back on that as one of the favorite periods of my life. Living with your 90-year-old grandfather as a sophomore in college might not sound like a lot of fun, but it was a lot of fun. We have a weekly schedule to mow the yard and visit different local restaurants that he liked to go to and do different things like that. And it really, I think, at a good time made me slow down a little bit, which I think is why I still enjoy muzzle loading. And I try to spend a lot of time with older generations. You can learn a lot and appreciate the way they live.
Oh, absolutely. I've got a friend of mine, this guy, Aaron Larson. He runs this grandparents academy. And what he ended up doing was he graduated from college in 2008, came right out into that recession, couldn't find work at all, and then moved in with his grandparents to help them out some, but then spent about a year or so with them and really learning to connect with them, learning a little bit of their prankster sides and some different sides of them that he wasn't necessarily exposed to at some of their other meetings and things. But being with somebody day in and day out, you start to get some of their good and bad idiosyncrasies, and you just learn them as a more complete person, let's say.
Yeah. I think that's a really special time, to have access to somebody's life at that, to see them as more than an ice cream trip and a fun time, to really learn about them and why they are the way they are. And then you can connect that, to your parents and see that influence, and then see how that comes all the way down to you. I think that's great.
Yeah. Now, were you continuing to shoot during college, or did you get back into it, or how did, and were the grandparents coming out to then see you and support you in some of the matches and things you were doing?
Yeah, as I kind of became a teenager, I'd say middle school, early high school, there was still quite a bit of shooting involved. And then towards the end of high school, I think the focus became more on studies and education and focusing on more things to further my education with the goal of being to go to college. Um, it my grandparents, I mean, goodness, they're over 60 years older than me at that time, so once you get, your mid to late 80s, you don't necessarily want to travel as far from home or be outside. It, like many things in life, I think that those things ebb and flow at the right times. And I think, so for me, coming out of high school and into college, yeah, it was kind of a period of absence really from muzzleloading into competition. It wasn't really until a couple of years after college that I had started to build a career and kind of knew what I wanted. I'd met my wife. We weren't married yet, but kind of similarly coming out of college in 16, economic ripples, or whatever, bumpy road, we'll say. I moved back to my hometown with the intention of being here for a little bit, but my wife and I just fell in love with it all over again. And I think part of that being back led me back to that muzzleloading period. By that time, my father's father was very sick and would pass away shortly after. And my mother's father was towards the end of his life as well. And I think that brought a lot of perspective too. And carrying on those conversations, reminiscing a lot about those early years, sitting on the soda cans or trying to get to the pistol line for an early relay, so you had the good weather and good light. You have a lot of those conversations, I think, at that point in your grandparents' life. And so I think that kind of brought everything back and made me realize that, it wasn't really ever about the accuracy of the target or the score. It was about that time spent. And so I think now for me, I want to shoot well and I shoot fairly well, but it's that quality time with me, my family, and my friends involved in the sport is what it's really about.
That's awesome and well said, because I know my understanding with muzzle loading is similar to some other communities that I'm involved in, where, it's as much the social part of something we do as friends as much as, getting top score or having the best run or doing, it's always fun to have those bragging rights. What you're doing with this is, I want to see a friend I haven't seen in a month and a half. I want to connect with these folks. I want to check in, see what's going on, joke around with folks. With your experience, because this definitely seems like muzzleloading is a great connection point that some grandparents could use with grandkids. Is there any pro tips that you might have on how to start to introduce and how people maybe that are outside the community, if you're interested, maybe you shot muzzleloaders at scout camp, or you saw, you went up to Gettysburg and you saw the reenactment and you thought some of that stuff would be cool or whatnot. And, you wanted to get into it and maybe even take your grandkids along with you.
Yeah, I think that's a great thing that we see at muzzleloading events and living history events is you see a lot of parents and grandparents toting around family members and kids, especially to expose them to that. And I think for a lot of us, that's kind of the easy thing to do to connect each other to American history and in local and regional history. Most of us get kind of the abridged version in school. We're all familiar with the history textbooks, but as you get older, you begin to appreciate things and you try to take your kids and expose them to that. And I think that's great. It's something I face a lot with the website and the YouTube channel, this exact question. And I don't have a great answer for it because it's complicated.
Right.
We live in an age now where the cool thing to do isn't, throw your family into a truck camper and take them on a U.S. Western tour of all the different muzzleloading matches. Maybe it wasn't the cool thing, but I think it's just exposure. I think it's exposing, your kids and your grandkids to it, and it might not stick. It might rain. It might be a horrible time, but it's that exposure to it. I talk to a lot of people my age and younger that are getting into muzzleloading, and their first interaction with it is, oh, my grandfather took me to such and such. My grandparents took me to this rendezvous, or we visited this event. And every one of them says, I didn't think about it. I didn't like it then, or I didn't think that it was a cool thing to do then. But 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, something happens. And I don't know if it's like me where, you're visiting that person towards the end of their time here and it gets you thinking about things, or if you're just getting older and you have an appreciation for more than you did before. It's not the newest whiz bang giz whiz thing. You start to look for something more. I honestly think that here in the United States, especially, we have what some people will call, and what I call at times, a blood memory for this kind of stuff, where because we all came from that time and people in that time, for some reason, we're drawn to it. And I think that there's a natural pull, there's a call to that. So I think that's a big part of it. Some people hear the call and other people don't, but it's really important to not force it. If it's really not their thing, don't force it. For me, there were times, I didn't want to shoot. I wanted to go play, and I don't ever remember being forced to go shoot at all. But it's something that I hear from people whose family tried to get them into something like this and didn't. I really recommend that if you have a muzzleloader, or if you're into firearms in general, to do a slow, comfortable exposure, because kids are sensitive. A lot of people joke about loading up a big charge and, bruising a kid's shoulder, to teach them that it's dangerous. But I personally think there's better ways to educate, inform, and teach that safety aspect to it that are a lot more fun and a lot more engaging for that kid. I think in the end, if we want something like muzzleloading to continue, I mean, we're just about to 100 years for modern muzzleloading, in the sense of, the National Association starting in 1933. We're just about to 100 years of that. And if we want it to continue for another 100 years like it has, we've got to continue to expose people to it, make it fun, make it safe, make it engaging. And I think we're at a time now with the internet that it's easier than ever to learn about it. So even if you're a grandfather listening to this and you don't know anything about it, but you think it's the kind of thing that might be cool, there's a lot of great folks on the internet that can walk you through it. I know a lot of guys that have bigger channels than me doing a fantastic job of walking through the basics of all this stuff. There's a lot of forums out there. I always joke with people that if you ask 10 muzzleloading enthusiasts how to do something, you're going to get 12 different answers. And that can be intimidating. But the more you read into the culture, that is, muzzleloading culture, the more you're going to start to see, like, okay, people are saying this, this, and this, that connects with this. I'm comfortable with this over here. How can I get from A to B and then back to 1 and 2 and then over to 4, and kind of find that niche. A lot of people today, and I think a lot of grandparents today, got their start with Jeremiah Johnson and a Thompson Center Hawk and rifle, and kind of piggybacking on the conservation topic we talked about before. But by the time you get to the 1970s, conservation was huge in comparison to what it was in the 50s. And you have the muzzleloading hunting seasons being a huge draw into muzzleloading. But it's great to hunt with a muzzleloader, but I always tell people you can use your muzzleloader, 12 months out of the year and not just one. And I think it's about finding a place where you can do that. The National Muzzleloading Rifle Association has a list of charter clubs across the United States. And while the internet is great, to learn and kind of get the terminology down and maybe figure out what you want to do, if there's a local club near you, it does not, you can't beat going to that local club and asking questions and learning. Every person from a club I've talked to is always excited to have somebody new come in. And I've heard a lot of stories about a family getting into it, maybe a father or grandfather taking a son or grandson that don't have any of the supplies, and getting plenty of loaner supplies to use to get engaged and try it out. So I really encourage you to try that. Go to your local reenactments or living history events and just talk to folks. People are there because they want to share and talk about what they love. You get tired by the end of it, especially if it's hot, you might be a little grumpy. You're wearing linen and wool, there's no air conditioning, but go and ask questions. And just like with the internet, ask questions to different people and you're going to get different answers. But, if a couple people might be grumpy or tired or it's not a good time, there's going to be people there that are excited to talk about it and share what they know and see what they can do to help you get started. It's a community driven by passion. And I think that passion is what's going to keep it going. It's not the internet. It's not the availability of supplies, and it's not necessarily competition or hunting just as a broad topic, but it's the passion that makes all of that possible. And if you're passionate about it, I guarantee you there's somebody else out there that's passionate about it too that would love to help you get onboarded, to use kind of the corporate term, I guess, but to get you into it and kind of see what you can do in it.
Oh, that's awesome. And it sounds like too that, and I'm speaking for myself, is I don't have a bunch of leathers. I don't have a bunch of this stuff, but I've got old CVA gun and I've got some stuff. And so if I found a club, it sounds like I would be okay to show up in my jeans and everything and like, hey guys, I just want to, shoot a little bit and get, some more practice in on my muzzle loader.
Yeah. Most clubs out there that have weekly or monthly events, you're going to go there and you're going to see a bunch of people in jeans and overalls. That's just, you don't need all the stuff. That's what everybody sees. Just last Sunday, I had my day off and I went out and I squirrel hunted in my 18th century gear. And that can be intimidating because there's a bunch of stuff that you have no idea what it is or how much it costs or where you get it from. But 99% of the clubs out there operate on blue jeans and a firing line where you're shooting targets. And I will say that you're absolutely take your CVA. What's great about the clubs and kind of the competition history of this is we've been competing with muzzleloaders in this organized fashion for almost 100 years. So even if you aren't a great shot and you don't have a fancy, target rifle, there's a lot of clubs use a class system. So if you show up, for instance, Greg, and you want to shoot your CVA, you're not necessarily going to be shooting against, for score, the guys that shoot every day or every weekend with their, perfected target rifles and their target loads and everything. You're going to be able to go in and shoot in your class as a novice or a beginner class and still compete, still have fun. And the whole time you're going to get a lot of feedback, a lot of, input, a lot of advice, that you can then apply or not apply. If all you want to do is your CVA and your blue jeans, you're going to be able to do that. And those clubs out there would love to have you. I'm not saying that after a few years, you're going to see a nice target rifle and want to get into that,
Right.
It's like sitting down in a nice car. It feels good. But there's that. There are those levels to it. We've talked about here that I have family equipment and toolboxes and things for all these different disciplines. But, I went to an over the log match that's been going on for 40 or 50 years now last fall. And there were folks showing up with specialized over the log target rifles. And there were people showing up with their Thompson Centers or their Traditions or their CVAs participating in the match because it was part of that local town's history. And everybody was welcome. Everybody had a great breakfast and everybody walked away with a prize because there's that, again, that spirit and that passion that goes along with that competition. And just like those meat shoots and those turkey shoots of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, many of the matches still have that today. On Instagram every week, just about every Sunday, I can see a group of people from different clubs in different states all showing, winning a couple pounds of bacon or winning part of a ham or a couple steaks. next to their match targets from that week. It's a great thing to get involved in, no matter the level at which you're stepping into it.
Oh, that's awesome. Because I think there are a lot of Gen Xers and baby boomers that have seen Jeremiah Johnson and have seen or read some magazines or read some books, and it's like, oh, I'd like to maybe go out and give that a try. So it's awesome that the community sounds like it's really open for a granddad and grandson or granddaughter to show up on a weekend and kind of check things out, maybe give it a shot, and literally, and
Yeah.
and see if it's something they want to use and as a connection point and as a way of having fun together.
Yeah, I think
Now,
it's a great thing to get involved with. It's kind of a stark contrast to daily life, and I think that adults and kids alike can find happiness in it.
Ethan, before we wrap everything up, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Can you give me your top 3 movies with muzzle loaders? And I think we've covered one of them already, but give me your top 3 that are like, oh boy, I want to go out and build a lean-to and hunt down a bull elk and, all that kind of good stuff.
I think Last of the Mohicans is a good one in my book. It's funny because the rifle the director wanted Daniel Day-Lewis to have was the wrong period, but that's the one that he liked. So that's the one that Daniel Day-Lewis had. I'm a big fan. I mean, Jeremiah Johnson's a classic. The Mountain Men is a classic. The Revenant diverges from the history of Hugh Glass quite a bit, but I think it's still an okay movie. There's a couple of weird ones out there that I really like. There's one in Australia, kind of set during the Wild West a little bit, but kind of the early West, and several people in that movie are toting muzzleloaders, I believe. It follows a thief who has stolen a bar of gold, and it follows him as he's trying to get it to a smeltery to smelt it down and get rid of the marks that are on it. And it's not necessarily about the muzzleloaders; they're just kind of part of it.
Right.
And there's a couple from Ireland from about the mid to late 19th century there, kind of during our Civil War. It's very similar to our Civil War era arms, and I cannot remember the name. I'm sorry. I'm horrible at being on the spot.
Oh, no, that's that. Yeah, like I said, I was putting you on the spot, so I know that. And, for me, I remember maybe a couple of Jimmy Stewart movies where he's running around in buckskins. I can't remember what they are, so maybe they're not that good.
Right.
But I want to say he's running around with some long rifles and buckskins and things, so I'd have to go back and check that out. I do want to ask you, as we get to the last little bit here, what are some of the lasting memories or lessons that you take away with you from your time with your grandparents?
Slow down and enjoy things. I understand it's probably cliche, but I think that was one of the big things for me with both of them, or all of them, was just it's okay just to sit for a little bit. Being a kid, that sounds horrible, but as a young adult now, running a small business and chasing my own toddler, those little moments of quiet are really great. I think people over things always is something that really stuck out with me. You don't chase the nice car, don't chase the fancy whatever. Make sure that you're taking care of your family and you're spending time with your friends. And it's I guess more particular to muzzleloading, but reading the wind was always something that we talked about in competition, and making sure you're not taking the shot in bad wind. And I think that carries over to a lot of life. I don't make a decision quickly, and I attribute that to my parents and my grandparents of slowing down and making sure the wind is right before I really do anything. Not that it always works, the wind can always come up and steer you sideways a little bit, but I think that carries over, and I think, having a little sweet now and then doesn't hurt anybody.
Absolutely. And, one of the things from an outsider, not necessarily a shooter, but that reading the wind is also, I would take that as being situationally aware. What's going on
Yep.
around you? What's going on in the world? Because then it feeds back into the people over things, right? What's going on with the
Yeah.
family? What's going on with these things? And so that's awesome advice. Ethan, where can people connect with you? Where can they follow you? How do they keep up with what's going on with muzzle loading?
My website's called ilovemuzzleloading.com. My handle on social media like Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube is also I Love Muzzleloading. That's really where the whole concept came from, was that root passion that we talked about earlier, and trying to come up with a name for what this kind of thing could be. At that point in my life, it was just, I love muzzleloading. It's not about me. It's about that passion and about that culture and people who are passionate about it. So that's where you can find me. It's a bit of a variety. I'll admit, it's kind of just whatever I'm feeling or whatever I find interesting with muzzleloading that week. But there's a lot of history, both contemporary and older history, interviews with different people involved in the space from all aspects of it. And then just kind of the happenings. I report on a little bit of muzzleloading news. If you can believe, there's news for firearms that are 200 years old, but there is. But I think I say somewhere it's about reporting on the people, places, and passion or something like that that has kept muzzleloading alive for 100 years and hopes to keep it around for another 100.
Oh, and that's awesome. And folks, I'm going to be sure to put links to all this stuff in the show notes. So folks that are out mowing the lawn or doing whatever, they can come here and then definitely get those links over to I Love Muzzleloading. Ethan, thank you so much for being on the Cool Grandpa podcast. I've enjoyed learning so much about Joseph and Harold and your relationship with them, as well as muzzleloading. It's been a blast. Literally.
Thanks so much, Greg. I hope that someday I can be a grandparent too, and I hope you can get your grandkids out there someday.
Oh, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. I had a fantastic time talking with Ethan. You might have picked up on that a little bit. I love being able to talk with him about how muzzle loading has been a really unique connection point throughout his family's history, as well as that history in Indiana. I wanted to be able to join Ethan early in November for his woods walk. And that's an activity where you might go out as a reenactor or living history interpreter, or you might just go out there like I was talking about and throw up your modern day tent and have your blue jeans on. But it's an opportunity for you to grab your muzzle loader, go through a walking target range, and be able to, safely shoot at a squirrel target or a turkey target or whatever it is. But being able to have that little bit of a connection point of what it must have been like back in the 18th century, in the 19th century, even in the early 20th century, walking through the woods, looking for game, something that would help feed your family. And it's those little moments that both create memories that last a lifetime, as well as build up connections to other people in your community that enjoy this activity. So I hope you loved it. Please go over and check out ilovemuzzleloading.com. That's Ethan's website. Look at all the information that he has going on there, and be sure to like and subscribe and check out his YouTube channel as well. So until next time, remember to stay cool.